Welcome to the Developmental, a podcast about the messy, beautiful ways grown-ups grow up. Here, we explore turning the science into the day-to-day practice of adult development in teams, homes, organizations, and life. Hello, my friends. I'm very excited to welcome you to this new episode of The Developmental, where we will be exploring the links between this new field in psychology, that is adult development, and ancient wisdom, and more specifically, the practice of mindfulness. There has been criticism towards adult development theories, calling them out for being too Western, too psychologically embedded, perhaps not inclusive enough of other ways of thinking or of other traditions. Well, today's episode will hopefully invite you to think through that argument in a different light, because as it turns out, the ancient practices such as yoga or mindfulness, the latter of which will be the focus of this conversation, actually can and do play an important role in vertical development. So, developmental science may be new, but the mechanisms involved are not. Accompanying me in this episode is Michael Bunting, an expert in mindfulness, author, researcher, and a leadership expert as well. Michael is the author of the best-selling books The Mindful Leader and A Practical Guide to Mindful Meditation. And he also co-authored Extraordinary Leadership in Australia and New Zealand with Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner. His latest book, published in 2022, called Vertical Growth, is a must-read book for anyone wanting to master self-awareness and lifelong growth. I found it an exceptionally practical guide for any or all of you and us who would like to explore mindfulness as a tool for self-growth. Michael is also the founder of Awakened Mind, a mindfulness app and a leadership consultancy called Work Smart. He and his team have worked with some of the world's most prestigious organizations in the area of executive leadership, mindfulness, mental health, adult development, and scaled culture change. Several of Michael's clients are award-winning best employers, and his app has been academically researched and proven to produce substantial improvement in key areas impacting mental health and team performance. Michael lives with his wife and 4 children in Sydney, Australia. Very relevant for me, Michael is a fellow nerd, so we have had some really great conversations about the intersection of our two fields previous to this one. We're very excited to welcome you into one of our explorations, and hopefully you'll leave this conversation with some practical tools too, which you can take into your personal growth practice or maybe even in your work. So without further ado, here is Michael. Welcome, Michael.
Wonderful to be here with you, Alice.
Great to have you with me. And I'm very excited. I feel like this conversation has been a little while coming, and we've had a few awesome long conversations nerding out on this intersection between mindfulness and vertical development. So it's really wonderful to be able to share one of these with people.
Great to be. Also excited to talk to you about this, and it's so excited that we've collaborated. You've actually contributed to one of our programs as well. So
yeah, I've been very excited to discover how beautifully you're interweaving these fields. And perpetually curious really to see how someone actually gets to this point. Like how do you get to where you got to? So maybe I'll start with this because I did share a little bit before this recording started about who you are professionally and how much you've accomplished. But I'm interested in the Michael, in the personal journey as well. So how did you come to mindfulness? How did it come to mean a lot? Because I know you're deeply passionate about it and you brought it into your work and you're sharing it with others. But first and foremost, you've made it a personal life journey, really.
Yes. So I'll give a short answer. When I grew up a very normal childhood. It wasn't in any way classically traumatized. I came to discover later that it actually was quite traumatized and that most childhoods are traumatized. In my case, it was a lot of cold trauma. It's cold trauma. So contrast between hot trauma and cold trauma. Hot trauma is an environment where you grow up where there's verbal abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. It's hot, it's invasive. Cold trauma is where all forms of inattention or neglect. So I think most kids nowadays go through a severe amount of cold trauma where the parents are on phones, devices, they're distracted, they're not really there, they're busy working lives. The child doesn't get enough connection, which then creates a deep sense of deficit and loss in the child, which then leads to narcissism and addictions and all other things that are so beautifully catered to by our society today. And when I was 22 and I finished my university degrees in business, which my father had pushed me towards, I wanted to do psychology. He pushed me to business and I got into the business working world. I remember this absolute shock, when I was meeting people in their 40s and their life just seemed to be holidays, working targets, and shallow conversations about what did you eat for lunch and coffee. And I was just horrified that I thought that there was this magical adult world that I was coming into that would be, full of secrets and mysteries. And it turned out to be quite the opposite. It was just dull and consumer-based and lifeless, and it disturbed me profoundly. And that set in a path to searching there must be more to this existence and this life than like this mundane consume, holiday, work. And I was lucky because my mom had started studying Eastern and Western philosophy and going to evening classes, and it was called the School of Practical Philosophy. So that was my immediate point. And then I studied intellectually these great teachers from, Socrates to Sufi to you name it, right? Eastern and Western philosophers. So they were all pointing to this hidden world of consciousness. But there was a particular point, maybe about a year and a half into it, where I was cycling. Like I would love the teachings, but I wasn't experiencing the mystery that they were talking about. And meditation was introduced in that group. And it was a very loathingly and resistingly, I suppose you've got to do that in meditation practice, right? You can't intellectualize yourself to freedom. You can't read books to freedom. You have to do the work. And so I started meditating in that context. And it was like it was the way the analogy I gave was like black and white TV went to color. Like everything started like this whole world lit up around starting to develop consciousness itself. And even though I remember for my particularly the first 3 or 4 years, meditation was grueling. I wasn't that skilled, and frankly, the way we were taught wasn't that skilled, but it was almost like a white knuckle determined experience, right? I'd like sit down, I would meditate half an hour in the evening, half an hour in the morning without fail. I did that for about 10 years. And there was a efforting to it, but there was also this presence that grew that started making sense, that I could validate what I was reading in books in my own experience. And I could only start validating that through my own internal experience with the mindfulness. So that's where I got increasingly convinced that, yes, the intellectual stuff's useful, but unless you actually do the work, the awareness work itself, it's actually quite frustrating and dry, the intellectual stuff.
So what was it, Michael, that because I've been playing with mindfulness in a very amateurish way for a long time, and I've had on and off periods, and I found it so hard to have the discipline to stick to it. And I'm curious, what drove you at that young age to really, the white knuckled effort? What was it that you were looking for, really? Yeah. When you say consciousness, what is it? What does that mean? And what was the mystery you were seeking in making this effort?
Yeah, that's a great question. There was what I thought I was seeking, and then when reality I realized later in life, right? The first thing that captivated my imagination was the term enlightenment. And enlightenment, by definition, was the end of all suffering, all psychological suffering, right? It was like complete freedom. Even the fear of death would dissipate, right? This is what these great sages would write about. And as a 22-year-old, that absolutely captivated my imagination. And there was a sense of this life, let me define this life by going for awakening, like this thing called enlightenment or awakening. And that was the primary driver. There was this like determination. I don't want to die not knowing what it is to be totally free of all fear and all death fear or loss fear. I need to know that, right? So that was the drive. I came to later discover that I was an arrogant young man, and I came to understand that arrogance was a compensation for profound wounding and pain in my body and mind. And that as much as I was chasing awakening, I was actually running also very hard, trying to heal my own demons I didn't even know I had, and also trying to escape. I was running away as much as I was running towards. And even the way I practiced mindfulness, and I think many people do this, they practice mindfulness unwittingly to try and escape their ordinariness of their lives for a while. And I came to realize that is unsustainable as well. And I think that's a big mistake a lot of people make with mindfulness. It's like, I'll go and do my Zen for half an hour. It's great, but it doesn't really give me that. Like, it's a lot of sacrifice and time to meditate, but it's not really giving me that. I know it's good for me, but I'm not really feeling my marriage changing, my parenting change. I'm not really seeing dramatic change. So, yeah. It's nice to have, but I won't continue. And I think that's where it's hard to sustain, when you're not really seeing a deep shifts in your actual
change.
life. Yeah.
I would love to pause and double click on this for a moment, because and it is something that we've touched on in other conversations around the spiritual bypassing. And I do see it a lot around me as well. And I think it's worth just, pausing for a moment and investigating. And by spiritual bypassing, we mean exactly what you were saying, people taking up spiritual practices like mindfulness, as a way to pursue a goal, but also escape something that is just hard to sit with. And in my own research, I found that those emotions hard to sit with, and I know you found it in your own work, are really crucial to our growth.
Absolutely.
So, I'm curious, what helped you see that? Like, how did you come to realize, I'm actually bypassing the real work here, which is way more messy and uncomfortable and painful than even the huge effort of sitting on the cushion and meditating for an hour every day?
Yeah. So the first thing I just want to say technically for listeners, and this is an important technical point for me, that the origins of mindfulness is like breathing. It's like you can't be watching this if you're not mindful. And the cultivation of mindfulness is more of a deliberate. It's like fitness is natural to human beings. You couldn't get up and go and get a glass of water if you didn't have some degree of fitness in the body. And then going to gym is a deliberate cultivation of more fitness or more refined fitness. Same with mindfulness. Like, mindfulness is a natural thing. But most of the time, if you look at the origins of the disciplined set of practices around mindfulness, you'll find most of them in today, they originate from the Buddha. Right, from Buddhism and the Buddha. Now, there's obviously lots of other traditions that meditate too. It's just I wanted to make a quick technical note that the Buddha never used the word spiritual once in his entire life, not once, and never considered mindfulness a spiritual pursuit. Or, in fact, the entire Buddhism is not a spiritual pursuit in the way we think of it as a sort of soul and outer way. It was just a simple way of developing awareness to see the truth of the mind and to see the truth of things, to meet them with a degree of honesty, as my son beautifully put this morning. Mindfulness is about meeting the world with honesty and awareness, meeting it with full courage and honesty and awareness. Now, coming
I love that.
Now, coming
that is so wise.
So, coming to your question, I think for me, what happened is I had a mentor that basically financially cheated me. And we were deeply dedicated to mindfulness and we're dedicated to honesty and consciousness. And this behavior was so out of line with what I thought. It broke my heart completely. And then it spurred this question: how is it possible for someone to be so dedicated to mindfulness, so dedicated to truthfulness, and still behave in such a way we now, from their shadow, such a dysfunctional way, that then compelled me to start searching out what was that all about.
Yeah.
And it was then that I began to understand bypassing, and that we collectively, me and this mentor and a group of us, had a whole way of bypassing a lot of messy stuff around the human existence. And it was Enneagram work, and then cathartic work, and depth psychological work, and then ultimately insight mindfulness practice that began to help me really look at the mess of being human, right? And the pain of being human, and again, to mindfulness, to meet that with compassion and presence and really look at it was actually and that's when my own sense of liberation and joy really accelerated. And then I began to understand, I just began to understand that you can't outrun, this is the quote, you cannot outrun your own shadow. And we delusionally think we can, but you can't. And it always snaps back if you don't look at it. So
can you give an example, Michael, of what does it mean to actually stop and face your shadow? What would that even look like? How do you know you're doing that?
I'll use, and I hope my son won't mind, but I'll use an example of my 25-year-old son. I recently spent some time with him in Europe, and the whole experience was very, let's go to the next thing, let's do the next thing, let's do the next thing. It was very hyped up. And then also he started sniping at me. There was these little Barbie comments coming towards, Barb-filled comments coming to me. I just stopped him at some point and I said, like, let's just can we, it was actually the last evening he was with me for 3 days. I was like, what's going on for you? And eventually we unpacked a sense of anxiety, but underneath that was this deep anger towards the world. He's in the sustainability business. And he's really angry, right, and justifiably so, with how things are on our planet. But it's also directed at individuals. And I asked the question, let's just feel the anxiety. Is it feel anxiety? And then as soon as you start feeling the anxiety, it would quickly come up as the rage. And it's like, oh, okay. So if you look at it, you've got anxiety is your way, your need to move is actually a running away from rage, right? So then if we just feel the rage, let's just feel it and really feel it, right? And then sometimes that, like shout out or whatever, feel it. What he quickly came to discover is that actually there's this deep calm underneath the rage. But for many people, they just spend their whole lives in the anxiety chasing. But there's things underneath that we're typically unaware of that are driving our behavior. Maybe that's a complex example. Let me use a really simple example. Why can't that person just understand me? A classic complaint people have, right?
Yep.
What in that complaint usually is a world of denial and a world of shadow. That simple complaint. It might be they don't understand you because you never listen to them, right? And you never bother trying to understand them. That could be something that's driving it, but you never see it, so they become me. It might be that the very agony of why people can't understand is that you're deeply needing people's approval to feel okay about yourself. Right. And so you're doing things that are like you're begging for approval and they can't bring themselves to give it to you because they feel yucky about it. That there's this world within a world. There's this whole other world happening underneath that the vast majority of us don't want to look at. We want to bypass. And we just think, if I can just get that person to understand me, then all will be well. The rainbows will come, the angels will sing, and I'll feel complete.
Yeah.
It works. So looking at that underneath world that really is driving the show is so critical, because if we can't look at it, we can't outgrow it. To use growth work, that we have the saying in our work, that which we cannot name, see, describe, and be curious about, we can never outgrow.
Yeah. And that is so consistent with some of the research coming in through adult development, right? Where somebody like Robert Keegan will say, the growth is about looking at what you before were looking through. So I think it's so beautiful in your example with your son. You were able to look at something, his behavior in that case, his agitation, that he was in that moment looking through. He was just behaving. He was not necessarily pausing to reflect on his behavior. But then it's a remarkable that he was able to hear you when you said, let's look at this. What is this? What is underneath? So then you supported him to look at what he before was looking through, and some precious insight came from that.
Yes.
So mindfulness and this intersection with lifelong development is about, really, as if I understand, your story and your meaning here, is about looking at what we before were looking through, but systematically, day in, day out, catching our behavior and being curious about what is it here that's motivating me to react like this, or triggering me, or what is it that I'm feeling, and why am I feeling? So getting really curious about your own patterns, even if it's uncomfortable and what you find you might not really like. It's not a version of yourself you'd necessarily be proud of, really.
So my son put it beautifully this morning, the same son. I had a chat with him this morning, and he said, I'm starting to see that the skill set around mindfulness, there's two things to mindfulness. There's deep honesty. It's the commitment to be honest with yourself. And then the skill set to actually be able to see things accurately are intertwined. They're like mutual friends. In other words, I might have the intention to be honest with myself, but I just don't have the awareness to see what's going on.
Right.
Or I have the awareness to see what's going on, but then I choose to go back into denial and pretend it's not there. And that there's this beautiful virtuous cycle, as he described it, between really being honest with yourself and really having the skill set to start seeing. And I think this is you and I had a chat where the idea of separating out mindfulness practice from growth work, or trying to do growth work without mindfulness, is absurdity to me, because if you take away the words mindfulness or growth, the very process that mindfulness is the process of looking at, and then skillfully, and this is critical, it's the whole skill set of where to look, how to look, and where to look, and then once you look, what to do with what you're looking at. So it's the where, the how, and the process of meeting the pain, and that's why there's this huge body of work, right? Huge, around that skill set. And not having that skill set, I often see in vertical growth work, when I listen, not you, Alice, but several people, when they go like, but how do you actually deliberately grow? It gets really vague. It's like experiences, and you got to let them, and it's really vague. It's not precise and disciplined. Whereas you go to the world of developmental mindfulness, what we call development mindfulness, it's very precise. I mean, it could not be precise. It's technically precise on exactly how to do this stuff. And at the ultimate level, it's even seeing the structure of the ego, even seeing. So, for example, one of the practice I've done on meditation practice is when we say, I am talking to you, just to use an example, we actually look at who's this I am referring to that's talking to you. There's an assumption, I'm talking to you. And then you actually, with mindfulness practice, you literally investigate, where does this I live?
Yeah. Who is the I?
What is this I? So you get down to that level of making that, instead of looking at that, instead of looking through it, because our entire lives, we look through I. I colors everything. And so mindfulness gives you the ability to go right to that level of looking right at the I.
Yep. And that is very, very aligned to some of my more recent reflections around, to come to your point, what is it exactly that grows, and how do we grow? Because I do think it gets very abstract, and people want to practice. And I know you've written this wonderful book, which I read and I loved, Vertical Growth, where you literally unpack what we're talking about here. How do you do this? But identity comes as one element that actually develops through the course of adult development, and even starting to question who the I is, or, what is your identity? What are the different aspects of that I, of that me that shows up in different moments, is a function of development, and actively inquiring into that supports development, which kind of brings us to this juicy, nerdy part of our conversation, because I would love to unpack a little bit more these connections between vertical development and mindfulness practice. Let's focus on the practice, because I know that is really important to you. There is research connecting the two, in the sense of showing that people who practice meditation techniques over years, they're more likely, if you measure them before or after, to grow vertically. So we do know that this practice supports vertical development, but it would be interesting to reflect on how, and you've started to touch on it a little bit more. So what have you learned about, what are the crucial ingredients? Because you take this work into organization and you support leaders in incorporating these practices. And organizations nowadays are going, we want more later stage leaders, we want more complex thinkers, we want all of that, but very often it becomes a sort of a chase, a sort of a race towards the later stages. And we know that's not really how it works. So what have you learned? What have you learned about this intersection?
So I think
smiling there.
Yeah, I'll give you one deeper, just a nerdy answer on the role of mindfulness in growth and how we see it. And then I'll talk about the business stuff. I just think the first thing is, for some reason, we need stability. Human beings need stability. And even the process of looking at something instead of looking through it requires some stable platform to look at it, right? I need some, and I think the process of growth, at least in my own personal experience, is by definition, it's destabilizing. It's very destabilizing. So, when I began, like a couple of years ago, I had a major crisis in my viewpoints around who I was in my work, right? And what I was doing in my work. And I was profoundly destabilized. And I remember I had this amazing conversation with a Zen teacher, a kind of post-Zen teacher, who said to me, "What's going on?" I was not in a good place. And I said, "I've lost my life purpose. I have no sense of life purpose anymore." And his response was, "How lucky are you? That's awesome." And I was like, "What?" That's not the right answer. And then he said to me, we had this amazing conversation of the destabilize, because life purpose gives us stability, right? It gives us a sense of, I am here and I'm going there and I'm doing this. And when that life purpose disappears, it's like, who am I? Where am I going? And what is this? Right? Everything gets destabilized, which of course is the process of growth, right? Because I'm losing an identity, I'm shifting, and I'm looking at an identity. And then he said to me, this lovely compassionate moment, he said, if you really need life purpose, Michael, let me give you how you can do that. And he said, "Do you like coffee?" I said, "I love coffee." So he says, "Well, when you make your coffee in the morning, make it your life purpose to make a great coffee. That's it." Right? And it, like, the penny just dropped for me, right? And what he was talking about is make your life purpose being present. Just being present. And what's interesting, which is a mindfulness practice, and what's really interesting is that when presence becomes our home, and presence by its definition, it's both stable and unstable. Because when we're present, there's this it doesn't make scientific sense, but experientially, we feel very grounded and solid when we're present. And yet, we're in very direct contact with the instability of everything. Everything is fundamental.
Because you could encounter anything in yourself or outside of yourself when you're fully present. So you don't know what you're going to get, but you do know that you're fully there, experiencing it, whatever it is.
Exactly. So there's a lovely expression in mindfulness practice: you cannot step in the same river twice, right? You can go to the same river, but that river is different, and that life is constantly unstable. So at one level, you come deeply at peace with the deep instability of everything, because that's just the nature of reality. And at the same level, you're stable in the instability. That's I think, technically the greatest gift of what mindfulness gives us, because the process of growth is disrupting, at least one of the processes for me, it's disrupting the existing viewpoints, all right? And invariably seeing that those viewpoints are limited because of their rigidity. They are a fixed viewpoint of something that gave us a sense of meaning making of our world, but they were inherently not true by purest definition, because no viewpoint, as even the Buddha said, there is no, he called it take no viewpoints, take no views. It's one of the 8 premises for awakening, is let all views go. It's like hold them as utility, not as truth. No view is an inherent truth, because reality is just constantly dancing and shifting. So that to me is the greatest gift of mindfulness. It gives me the stability to handle the disruption of growth.
Yeah.
So and that my identity sits more in presence than what's called a constructed identity in mindfulness. I'm more comfortable that my identity is awareness itself, which is fluid and open, not the story of Michael Bunting. And that the story of
Yeah.
mindful hunting is literally, it's called in mindfulness practice at the pointy end of advanced mindfulness practice, it's called the constructed identity. It's literally the words constructed identity. So you'll hear these weird things like there is no self. And what does that means? It doesn't mean that you don't exist. It means there's no constructed identity has any reality. The presence itself, that which can witness the constructed identity, that's real, the presence, but not the constructed identity, because it can be let go of.
This does remind me of a conversation I had with a senior leader a couple of years ago, who was talking about how his identity was deeply challenged by. So when COVID came, he found himself for the first time in a position where he felt he had no control, he had no idea what to do, and he was leading this 10,000 people organization, and people were looking at him for solutions, and he was trying to articulate how discombobulating it was to feel so powerless. And somebody asked him, he was being interviewed as part of a leadership development program, about his experience. And how did you deal with that? And he said, look, I tried to do what I'd always done, like fix it, solve it, work through it, stay strong, don't talk about it, because I felt like if I told people how disoriented I was, I would just seem like useless. Like, why am I there? And he found that just didn't work. So he had to kind of slow down and really face the powerlessness and the fear and the anxiety, and just be present with it, to be able to then open up to his board and say, guys, I have no clue. But I do believe that together we can find a way out of this. But I just have to accept I can't. I'm not going to be the one with the answers here. But it was a loss. He was talking about how he was grieving that part of his identity, because he had to face that, no, I've just entered uncharted territory, and that identity of the fixer, the problem solver, and I just hit its limit. There's no way I can find my way out of this with that persona. I've got to become the person who is vulnerable, inquires, brings other brains in, really co-creates. And that can be super hard to do.
There's a beautifully, I just had a very similar interview with one of our team on this exact, he basically, you've just described him, and he described it like that too. And
there must be more than one leader going through that conundrum.
Exactly. And he described it as when I'm fixing and I'm doing, I'm the champion. I'm the one who's rescuing everybody. I'm the awesome one, right? And there's a deep level of image management in that. Like, and then when I open up and I tell the truth of what I don't know, and I tell the truth, that whole identity can't exist, because now I need help. I'm not the one who needs help. I'm the one who does help. And it's fascinating how we get caught. And he put it beautifully: is that the image management trumps reality. You're not acknowledging reality and its needs. And so I love the term psychological flexibility, and that's one of the terms we use in our work for growth, because I have the flexibility to meet reality as is required, not through my rigid identity.
I do want to maybe open up a bit of the black box of vertical development here, because I know the two of us found a really interesting link, which I'd love you to talk about. So in order to have that psychological flexibility, you need to be able to withstand some very, very negative emotions in the moment. And we were talking about before in our previous conversations, how confronting that is for leaders who have been used to being successful, who feel they've got a lot invested in that image management, consciously or unconsciously. So one thing that I found in my own research has been that the leaders who do grow from adversity tend to be those who find a way to accept the really painful emotions, anxiety, fear, confusion. Confusion, I find, is a hugely challenging one for leaders, for high-performing people. And the way the people in the research did that was they looked at those emotions as opportunities for growth. So the story they told themselves in their heads about that, what that emotion means, was not, it means I'm weak, it means I'm losing it, I'm losing my touch. No, they were saying, oh, it means there's some growth here. There's something that I haven't figured out yet. There's an opportunity. So that allowed them to pour curiosity like an antidote almost over the negative emotion, that made it bearable enough for them to then find that psychological flexibility. And I remember when I shared this piece of my research with you, you told me, there's actually a very specific type of mindfulness that does just that. It trains people to build what I called in my own research the contrasting emotion space, a negative plus curiosity as a positive, to create that space of, yes, I can tolerate this discomfort, therefore I can change something, I can do something about it. So can you talk about what that type of practice is that with a mindfulness lens you can actually do to build this contrasting emotion space?
Build the contrasting emotional space in the growth muscle.
Yes, the growth muscle.
Okay, so pause. I think this is the courier. 1 second.
Yeah. Wait.
So the technique involves, let's just talk about two kinds of mindfulness. There's two kinds of formal mindfulness practice. There's what we call concentration, stabilizing, serenity practices. They're one gang or group. And then this other group called, the original word was insight mindfulness practice, or what we call developmental mindfulness practices. And let me just keep it really simple for your listeners. Most of what people are taught around mindfulness in the modern world is all concentration, serenity mindfulness, because it's cool, it makes sense for well-being, and and so a lot of people a lot of people we speak to in the growth development space have not put the dots together between mindfulness and growth for good reason, because they think mindfulness is just the serenity practices. Now, what the serenity practices are, the calming or concentration practices are by technique. Let's say you sit down to meditate and you use an object of attention use your breath, or some people use a mantra. The point of it is to bring the mind to a deep state of present-based concentration. That's what's called concentration practice. And then the goal is serenity. Like there's a point where the mind stabilizes completely, none of the distracted stuff's going on in the mind, and it's just, the breath or just the mantra. And it's a beautiful, profoundly nourishing place for you to go. And this perfect stillness, right? And that usually is the beginning. And if you're doing an insight practice, you get there, then you begin the insight practice. For most people, it's like that's the end of the deal. That's sort of like I'm calm. And so let's say, for example, you have an addiction behavior around ice cream. I'll just use a really random example. You go and meditate for 20 minutes or whatever, half an hour, and you are serene, and all your addiction tendencies sort of settle down, and and you're just happy, right? You come out of the meditation practice and you go sit down on your couch, and something happens that's distressful, and before you know it, you're eating the ice cream because it's a compensatory behavior around undealt with anxiety or undealt with stuff inside yourself. So meditation or mindfulness is like a break from your normal self. It's not a journey.
It's like taking an aspirin. It just calms you, calms the pain for a little while. Yes.
And in and of itself, very useful. It does actually. It's like good rest. It's like good exercise. It's good for you. What it doesn't do, though, is it doesn't give you the skill set to actually manage what's going on in the process of dysfunction or addiction. So in many ways, what I would describe growth as is the dropping away of addiction. It's another way of describing growth. That's how it's a dropping away of addiction to being right, addiction to knowing, addiction to being in control, addiction to substances, or addiction to TV. Or it's like where there's more and more growth inside, that I'm less and less addicted. I'm then involved for more open, wise, handle complexity. So the insight practices, the technique and philosophy is different. The very original, and I'm just being technically nerdy now for a second, the original point of the insight practices wasn't calmness or concentration. The point was to see the nature of reality as it actually is. And the primary thing you want to see is that nothing is stable and nothing is fixed, solid, or it's the nature of impermanence. And
so it would be almost radical honesty, inside and out. Radical honesty, seeing things as they are.
Correct. It's really seeing, because the principle of mindfulness was never set up for the purposes of adult growth. The original intention of mindfulness was to relieve suffering, to stop all psychological suffering, and therefore all our actions don't inflict suffering on others. It's this deep commitment to joy and love and compassion and kindness and honesty and ethics, right? It's the reduction of suffering in our society, in ourselves. And so when I'm looking at impermanence, we ask what creates suffering. Primarily, what creates suffering is holding on, grabbing, fixation, called tana, thirsting and fixing. When I see that things are really impermanent, then all grabbing on lets go, which is also, funnily enough, connected with adult development, right? I'm not fixed in viewpoint because I can let it go because I see nothing stable. But interestingly enough, there's the side effect, right? That is where I think from a more modern perspective, growth happens. Is, let's say I'll give you the difference of techniques. If I'm meditating and I'm anxious and there's a lot of anxiety in my system, the thoughts are going mad. In a concentration practice, what I do is I ignore the thoughts, I ignore the anxiety in the body, and I just focus on the breath. And then the system has calmed down. In an insight or development practice, I don't do that at all. I let go of the breathing as my focus of attention, and I bring my attention straight into the anxiety in the body. And I become deeply interested in the anxiety in the body. And
so you're a leader, you're practicing this, you'd feel the anxiety in your body, and you'd put your attention on exactly the thing that you would most want to ignore, really, because it's so unpleasant, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So you make it the focus of your meditation to observe how that anxiety plays out. Is it a flutter in your stomach? Is it like your breath is constricted, your heart is racing? What is going on physically? What are the physical manifestations of that, right?
In some sense, you could say, yes, exactly. It's almost two questions. What's anxiety feel like? Take the word anxiety away and let's just feel it. Is it butterflies? I'm becoming investigatory interested. What's going on? What does this feel like? That's the first.
So you're curious about it.
Yes. And then what happens in that curiosity is magical, because what one begins to see, now you can't engineer this, you have to just do the looking. And the looking in this case means feeling the feelings, right? It's a form of looking, being curious about it. Is you then begin to see the secondary assumptions, the secondary reactions. So for example, many of us are anxious about being anxious. So we get anxious and then we get anxious about being anxious, but we never see that double layer of anxious about being anxious until we bring our attention into and really look. And then we go, oh, it's interesting. I have a particular relationship with this anxiety, which is resistance, which is panic. And then I notice secondary, and my seeing becomes much more refined. Now, the other thing that happens is in the process of seeing, I begin to start realizing that it's okay. I can manage anxiety. I can sit with anxiety. I'm not destroyed by it. There's nothing bad happening here. I developed this muscle, the ability to sit with, feel with anxiety. Now, once that's developed, I then begin to see underneath the anxiety what's really going on here at another level. But crucially, I developed the muscle to no longer be driven by the anxiety. Another way, because I think all dysfunctional behavior, and I mean, when I say dysfunctional behavior that feels good in the short term, but long term does damage to us and others, I would define dysfunctional behavior. It's driven by feeling avoidance. It's all driven by feeling
avoidance. We're trying to avoid the nasty feelings.
The dreaded experience, like anything but this is the way we describe it. And it was so beautifully illustrated. Now, bringing it into leadership for you, this was beautifully illustrated by Stephen Barrett, who at the time was the global head of HR for Novartis, where he said to me, he gave me this pre and post mindfulness comment, right? Now, I'm using Stephen openly like this because it's published in our book, right? This is public knowledge. Stephen said, before mindfulness, I prided myself on being an extremely rational person who only made rational decisions, right? Post mindfulness, I've begun to discover that I'm highly irrational and highly driven by emotion, even though I was blind to it. I said, okay, we'll explain more. He said, well, okay, let me give you an easy example. Some people, I would see they're not performing in the way I want them to perform. So then, so out of my own emotional avoidance of the uncomfortable conversation, I rationally think to myself, well, you know, they're smart, they're technical, they'll get it, don't worry, they'll work it out. Right? So I ignore the reality of me actually having to deal with it, because what's actually happening is emotional avoidance. I'm scared of the emotions that will come up if I go and confront that person. So then what happens is they carry on badly and eventually they don't deliver. Then I'm angry with them and then I start micromanaging them. And then they're confused because am I empowered or am I micromanaged? And at the root of all of that is then not only mismanage my anxiety for having the honest conversation, I then mismanage my anger. And then I mismanage, and all of this before mindfulness, I thought I was just a very irrational man. I gave them a chance, and now they're not doing it, so now I have to micromanage them. And all these rational thoughts that backed up my rational behavior, but looking beneath, it's all driven by emotional avoidance and emotional mismanagement.
Yeah. I think this is an example that will resonate with so many people. And it also brings up a question that I've heard a lot. And particularly in the business environment where rationality is so prized, if you sit with your emotions, you do the insight mindfulness practice, you really feel your anxiety in your body, you acknowledge you have all of these difficult emotions. Are you going to get lost in them? Are they going to overwhelm you? Are you going to lose your capacity for objectivity, for rational thought, for all of those things that are so useful and you want to hold on to? So what would you give people from having done this work with hundreds of leaders over the years as, the reassurance? Because in my own work, I did find that when people sit with the difficult emotion and put curiosity on top, it actually creates a space of clarity for reason. Interestingly enough, it opens up possibilities.
Yeah.
But I'm curious what you found both in your own practice and also supporting hyper rational leaders to get in touch with their
yes. Yes, I remember, I'll give you a funny conversation that highlights this more broadly, where we were working with an organization in hospitality, and I asked all the leaders, so how have been handling the COVID experience? Because you imagine their business got killed through COVID. And they said, oh, yeah, we put on a brave face and we really we tell people it's going to be good and everything's going to be great and we're all good. And then I said, okay, so, and so when your boss does that to you, your boss, everybody's got a boss of a boss, right? When your boss does that to you, how do you feel about that? And then they all said, I felt a little bit like, am I the only one that's messed up and struggling here? And I said, okay, so let me get this straight. When your boss does that to you, it fundamentally makes you feel insecure. And then you then go on and then tell your direct reports that you do the exact same action, right? Everything's got to be great. And you haven't put the dots together that you feel insecure. And the reason why they haven't put the dots together primarily is because they're not investigating their experience while that news is landing, because they don't have the skill to investigate their experience. And that's a beautiful example of irrational and irrational, right? So if I rationally watch my experience as my boss is telling me, oh my God, everything's going to be great and it's all great, and I start feeling inadequate and insecure, if I notice that feeling in that moment, I notice the connection between that, then I can make a much more rational choice with my own direct reports and go, all right, there's a good chance this is going to happen when I do this. There's no connecting of the dots of emotional drivers and the reality of the experience. The second thing, to your point, which is hilarious, right? I remember I was working with a particular leader in Singapore, and I asked her, what do you do with your difficult feelings? And she says, if I just get on with it and I bury them. And I'm like, so I laughingly said, how's that working out for you? And she says, I'm progressively feeling more anxious and sort of unknown. So I asked the question, and this is an example of multiple, my whole career, there's been two dominant complaints about mindfulness, this year 20 something of this field. The first is this complete delusional view that if I feel my feelings, which is exactly what she said, she said there's this pervasive sadness, is how she described it, right? And I said, what would happen if you felt this sadness? It's a simple intellectual question. She said, I'll get lost in it forever. And I said, just intellectually, and never mind experientially, I said, so you believe feelings have a permanent shelf life, that you can it's literally possible to feel sadness and then never come out of sadness. You actually think that's possible. And she got confused, and I said, you believe in permanence in a world where there is no permanence. It's literally delusional. It's like you believe in fairy tales. That's how crazy it is, because all feelings...
How did that land?
Well, she was sort of initially shocked, and it's so obvious when you look at it. It's so obvious, right? But for some reason, the delusional mind, because it doesn't investigate, like we talked about, it doesn't have the process to investigate. It sits in a world of fears and delusions that are based on literally fairy tales. They're not real. And so then I said, well, let's just that particular day, I happened to be feeling sad too. And I said, I'm feeling really sad. And guess what? I'm doing my job right now. Is it possible to be sad and do your job? That was mind-blowing for her. Possible to be sad and doing my job, right? Yes. Is that possible? So then what we did is we felt into the sadness. We identify, because the problem is when you keep it conceptual, it's still scary. But if you take sadness, the word sadness away, and you say, just report how it is in your body, in your guts, in your chest right now. Is it hard or soft? Is it hot or cold? Is it moving or still? We use these are part of the skill set of mindfulness, bringing things down to base experience, not all the elaboration of the mind, which just terrifies us.
We don't talk about feelings. We really try to describe the sensations,
the felt experiences. And then, before you know it, she was crying. And then within 2 minutes, she was laughing. And then there was this palpable lightness. And I just asked her, she stopped and I said, what's just happened now? And then we just simply unpacked what happened for her. Oh, it turns out sadness is not permanent. Would you believe it? I mean, shock and horror.
Yeah.
So what happens, and this is again what we talk about in mindfulness, what's called the second arrow, this is how it was originally described. When the unmindful mind meets pain, it adds pain to the pain. What does that mean? It's called the original analogy is when someone gets hit with an arrow, they pick up an arrow and start stabbing themselves with the second arrow, put the second arrow down. The second arrow is the resistance to the feeling. Now the resistance,
which only adds to the pain of the feeling.
It adds to the pain of the feeling, and more importantly, it must lead to addiction fixated behavior. It's binary. It's hard to accept this emotionally and intellectually. You feel the feeling or you go dysfunctional. Take your pick. It's black or white. Yeah. It's like you're either going to feel the feeling and embrace it, or you're going to go towards your rigid old coping mechanisms that don't actually serve your life to deal with that feeling. Easy example, jealousy. Let's take a really easy example, jealousy. So what is jealousy? You could say it's the fear of being alone, or it's the fear of abandonment. If you can't feel that feeling and you can't befriend that feeling and then eventually, quote unquote, conquer that feeling where it no longer rules you, as soon as the feelings of insecurity and it's possible, you will go for the controlling behavior. What time did you come home last night? Who did you see? When did you see? And all of that behavior is literally destroying your relationship. And it's based on the fact that you don't have the skill set to go, when I'm jealous, where's that in the body? Can I sit with that in the body? Can I feel that? Can I know that? Can I breathe with that? Can I befriend that? To the point when it's not scary to feel that anymore. Now, if it's not scary to feel that anymore, then I'm not driven by the compensatory controlling behavior anymore. Yeah. I've now grown, I'm free.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful example. And I think you said something really important here that might be worth highlighting. The outcome of doing this is not feeling those feelings anymore. We will still feel them. But the idea of befriending them is all about not being ruled by them, not being scared that they'll last forever, not feeling like we're going to get lost in this pain and never come out. It's going to impair my ability to function. You'll learn that it's okay to feel your feelings, and you can actually navigate that pretty skillfully.
Yeah,
and it's not overwhelming anymore.
Yes, and I would also say to people, one of the things we ask in the beginning of our programs usually, and we're usually working with PhDs and masters and highly smart people, and we say, were any of you guys taught through all your formal education to skillfully work with your mental and emotional world? And pretty much 99%.
Nowhere, never.
If they did, they found it on their own, and it's like, well, then how come we would possibly, if you're all smart, how could you possibly think that you'd be good at this? And have you ever appreciated the consequences this is having on your life and your leadership? Because we see it again, like we have a leader we're working with right now. She controlling behavior has served her really well. And now she's reached a point in her career where she's now the leader of really smart, self-directing people. And that controlling behavior is literally killing her career right now. And it's a beautiful example where there's the invitation to growth, right? What got you here is not going to get you there. And we can see that part of that controlling behavior is so much fear. She's got a deep association of losing control equals lots of pain for her from her childhood, from that conditioning. And it's like if she doesn't know how to navigate those panicked feelings of pain when she's really empowering people, those panicked feelings are going to they're going to snap her back into the control, and she will literally end up losing her job. And so if you think that not being able to work with your emotions is unimportant, if you think it's unimportant, it's just because you just haven't, I don't know how to describe this without sounding cheeky, but it's like you just haven't really gotten it yet, because it's so obvious and fundamental to the process. Sorry to be over enthusiastic, another beautiful example is in our personal relationships. In our romantic relationships, we all long to love and be loved. All of us. We want to love with all our heart, and we want to be loved with all, and receive all of that love. And yet we find ways to not love and to resist and to sabotage. And it's crazy, right? You show me one person who would say, my romantic relationship is meeting perfectly my needs for deep love and connection and growth and to love and be loved, right? There's all these other things that go on, right? Sabotages. And the primary reason why is because opening the heart and really loving is emotionally terrifying. And letting love in is emotionally terrifying. It touches on vulnerabilities that are just, we long for it, but vulnerabilities we can't handle. Unless we learn how to navigate those vulnerabilities with skill and stability, and we become less afraid of the pain and the hurt and the loss, we never really get the very love we seek. We actually spend our lives longing for what we ourselves are getting in the way of.
Yeah. Resonate with that so much, and I'm smiling because the previous podcast episode I recorded was with my closest friend, who's also a yoga teacher and a leadership development expert herself, and she was talking about how their yoga, the yoga swami that she's learned the craft from, used to tell the group, relationships, romantic relationships in particular, are not about making you happy. They're about making you grow through the limitations of the other. And what I'm hearing, almost the add-on to that in what you're saying, is if you accept they're there to help you grow, then love becomes the conscious choice to lean into that growth and face your own limitations and kind of get into that hard work that a beautiful, loving relationship actually is. Yes. So don't stand in the way of your own love.
Exactly. It's like we always say, we have seen the enemy and they is us, right? And which is not a right.
It's us, yeah.
Passion, but yeah, and it's beautiful because you get back a sense of agency. And I think that's what I most love about adult development work is that the more we grow, the more we have agency over our lives. We have more and more sense that our happiness is really like the Sean Aker study, the 90-10. 90% of it is the way we think and 10% our external life. It becomes a reality as we grow, because we begin to see that we can always choose consciousness, and we can always see where and how we are contributing to our own suffering. And in the seeing of that, which most of us are dedicated to not see, and as soon as we not see it, then we believe that our pain is caused by the outside world. We become a helpless victim. But in the seeing of it, we regain this profound sense of agency and the ability to constantly adapt and grow.
Yep. Michael, I mean, we could spend 3 days unpacking all the richness that you've given us in, this short time. But I would love to just zoom out as we're near the end of this conversation, because you're what, 2 decades into this, doing this work yourself, and keep on unpeeling the onion for yourself, but you're also taking it into organizations, and you've got a beautiful program which you've just rewritten and upgraded that you're offering organizations, and you're also offering it as an open offering. What's driving you? Like, what's your highest hope? Why do you believe this type of really personal, intimate work in its essence is actually crucial for leadership, for organizations, for the future? And I know you're so deeply passionate about your work. So I'd love to hear what is it that's keeping you, and what are you really hooked by that's, helping you push forward with this and want to bring it to more organizations?
I think just the latest way, and to keep it really simple and not go on another 2-hour reply, is it was beautifully summed up by the recent research. It was a quote from Robert Keegan where he said everybody's doing two jobs in an organization. There's their real job, the actual work they have to do, and there's this whole other job called image management, which is hiding weaknesses, being political, over perfectioning slides, conversations after conversations, this whole other political. And then we've researched it, to be fair, not really disciplined research, but polling more than 5,000 people on this, right, in multiple organizations. And the average people say is 40%. So they're wasting 40% of their time and energy on image management. So they only 60% of their time is actually spent on real work. The rest of it's just this whole other hiding political game. And everybody knows this. And then when you inquire more deeply, is so much suffering that comes with that. There's so much suffering. Nobody enjoys it. And so how is it that we as a human species keep producing things that really, really don't serve us and hurt us? And at the very core of that, we when we investigate it more deeply, is a deep belief system. And it's echoed beautifully in Gabor Mate's work, which is that for most of us, when we're growing up, when we're little, we have these two fundamental needs for authenticity, what we call integrity, the need for integrity to be our true selves, right? Our most functional, happy true selves. We also have the need for attachment with our parents. And whenever there's a conflict, when being my true self earns disapproval from mom and dad, the child will always sacrifice their authenticity and integrity for the attachment, because we need the attachment for survival. So for most of us, we grow up in a world where we do not believe it's possible. Deeply inside our nervous system, we do not believe it's possible to have the deepest integrity with ourselves, to show up with absolute honesty and integrity, and to have safety and belonging and approval and connection. We don't believe those two are mutually together. We sacrifice. I have to show up a certain way. That's not me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even aware of it anymore, what we call image management. And I think that the deepest yearning in our work, the deepest why for our work is that it's like to help organizations develop in a way where authenticity, integrity, deep integrity, not dysfunctional authenticity, real integrity, and organizational effectiveness and belonging and compassion all exist together. Not only will they make more effective businesses, we know they make much more efficient. You just take out 40% of burnt resources, but they actually become a place where people literally heal themselves. You're literally you're healing yourself through the workplace, because you're starting to re-experience something where you can be really honest and people actually value it. You can really own your mistakes and people appreciate you owning it. You can be vulnerable and you don't get shamed and punished for it, because most of us don't experience this as children. So it's the intention, the deepest intention of the work is to redefine organizations so that they become places where people, they literally become more whole inside themselves. That's what drives us as an organization.
Yeah, I love that. And I love what you said about organizations of being places of healing versus places of suffering.
Yeah.
That is such a powerful intention. So, Michael, if somebody has never, done any kind of mindfulness practice, not read anything about it, where would you tell people to start? How do you make this tangible, actionable? What's the one thing that you think, if you were to start somewhere, start here, and if there's maybe one practice to experiment with, try this one?
Yeah. So two answers. The most obvious is there's multiple apps. We've got a great app, but there's lots of great apps out there now. And, Headspace, 10% Happier, Insight Timer, our app Awaken Mind. By the way, just for people's info, our app Awaken Mind is very emphasis on the developmental style of mindfulness. It's a group of practices that we give leaders to grow, not to just be calm. Our orientation is not mental health and calmness. Our orientation is growth. And then just to meditate a little bit each day, like 5 or 10 minutes a day, is a great start, and then become curious. I will say, however, in deepest integrity, it's not enough. It is extremely important to find a good teacher. It just is. It's just because it's not because the practice is complex. Mindfulness practice is actually quite simple, as we've described, focus of attention, when difficult feelings arise, feel into them. There's a set of practices. You can learn all of that on the app. The tricky part is that the mind is so delusional and so committed to its ignorance, and that's a horrible way of saying it's committed to comforting us. So, it's like if my only go-to to deal with my anxiety is to eat chocolate cake, if you take my chocolate cake away from me, I get pretty, I have to face things I don't want. So therefore, I tell myself, that chocolate cake's okay today. We're so good at the rationalization, the justification, that we kind of trick ourselves. And it's super useful to have a skillful mindfulness teacher because they can see what you're not seeing. Now, I will say this, though, the last word on that is never trust any teachers. Because the world is littered with abusive teachers. So yes, trust teachers, but only to a degree where they are helping you author your own experience. They're helping you investigate your own experience. They're not telling you how you should be experiencing things. That's dangerous. They're not telling you how you should live. They're inviting you into an inquiry. They're giving you skills, but they're inviting you into more curiosity around what your life's producing.
So seek the teacher who's really supporting you to own your own learning rather than being the guru that seems to have all the answers and give them to you.
Exactly. And the second mark of choosing a good teacher is, are they ethical? Like, if there's any ethical doubt, run a mile. And again, I say this tragically because there are people in this field who are ethically, they have so much wisdom, and then they use that wisdom to their advantage, and then they actually act unethically. That's the other bottom line, is that ethics and values and virtues matter. They really matter. And that's another test of, does this person live a virtuous life? Do the way they conduct themselves is virtuous? And it's good old basic virtue, right? They're kind, they're compassionate, they're honest, they're respectful. That matters. It really matters.
Yeah. So practice at least 5 minutes a day, and look for a good ethical teacher who can be a good mirror.
A good teacher, and also don't expect results. Now, this is the weirdest thing to say. Because this is the example of the tricky mind, is the mind plays a game called what we call the when-then game, or the if-only game. The when I meditate, then I'm going to be more present, then all the goodies in life, or then when I'm one more step above in the ladder of growth, then I'll be more happy, etc. The irony is, as soon as you're in that thinking, you're not present anymore. This is the tricky part. It's like being present is quite a radical thing, because it's like, I'll practice. It's almost like this. If you're going to practice mindfulness, practice 10 minutes a day and don't have any regard if it's working or not working, or it's not anything in your life for 6 months. It's a little bit.
So let go of your attachment to outcome. Let go of the need to perform.
Exactly. And then the irony is that's where you get the best result. It's so weird, but it's a bit like a lot of people have these ridiculous expectations of mindfulness. I've been practicing mindfulness 5 minutes a day. My life hasn't changed. That would be like someone saying, I've been doing 5 minutes of exercise a day and still I'm continuing with all my other habits. And it's like, it just hasn't made any difference in my life. Exercise is junk and rubbish. It's like, what? No.
Yes. I will post a few resources, including a lot of your work in the episode notes and the apps you talked about as well. So one last question to close us, Michael. How are you keeping yourself honest? How are you keeping yourself, walking your talk? Because you are in turn a teacher supporting others' growth.
Yeah.
So what's your practice for keeping on walking the path?
I'd say I have two dominant and they're philosophical practices. I'm not talking about just meditating. They are, my first practice is, as soon as I feel any kind of victim story in my mind, like I'm a victim of my wife, I'm a victim of my children, I'm a victim of my clients, whenever there's any quality of victim story in my mind, I have this disciplined practice of looking to where I can own it and how I'm creating it, right? That's one of my deepest practices. It's like, no victim here, right? The second thing that I found, and that I have this term we teach our clients called, what's my part in this? Oh, I'm not getting enough love in my marriage. Okay, well, what's my part in this? Oh, my children are not blah, blah, blah. What's my part in this, right? It's a hard question to answer, but it's a deep commitment to that. Because I have this deep conviction that until there's ownership, growth is technically impossible to happen. Until there's accountability, it's like you haven't even got in the, if you're trying to swim, you haven't even got in the water yet until there's accountability. As long as you're entertaining stories of its victim and someone else's fault, there's no growth. And the second thing, the most dominant practice of my life is being values-based. So, and I treat values as a growth instrument, not as an image management. I stand for integrity. I look at the subject. My two favorite ones are kindness and honesty are my two core practices, along with the ownership practice. And I use them as a way to keep examining my life as to where I'm out of integrity, where I'm not quite. And I also have a very committed practice to my team to be ruthless on me, like ruthless on me. And I regularly ask them, how am I going? Have I had any unkind moments? Have I, because I think I see the perfection of a value like kindness or a value like, or virtue like honesty. I see them as a magnificent path to growth, because integrity, for example, goes from the understanding at the lower levels of development as doing the right thing, right? That's the sort of classic understanding of it. And as we evolve more and more, it becomes the understanding that integrity is the route to complete wholeness and the absence of all suffering. It's like, it's how I recover all the shattered parts of my being. And I start regathering into presence, and I start feeling whole. And the word integrity's got it. The word means to be whole without cracks. And so the very meaning of the virtue shifts and changes and becomes an invitation to growth instead of a brand. I stand for integrity. And so I think bringing that mindfulness and growth to values is so precious, because there is no ever reason why you didn't follow your value other than it's your own. I wouldn't use the word fault advisedly, but it's your own. If you're not in integrity,
responsibility.
It's your own responsibility. And in that, then you begin to see what fears drove me there, what assumptions drove me there. And just in that simplicity is how I'm deeply committed to that in my own life.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And it did, when I first met you, I think this last piece that you talked about, how you are led by your values and kind of calling yourself out when you feel like you're not aligned with your values and your actions and your values are not aligned, really struck me. And I think there's so much wisdom in having a disciplined practice to check in on that alignment, which is something I'm sure many others can just take and as another practice for us. What are some values that are important for people, and are we living them? Are we actually embodying that value? And who are the mirrors, the honest mirrors around us to tell us that you're actually not showing up the way you think you're showing up? And
to know that when they tell you that, you're going to be angry with them.
Get ready for that.
And then you're going to know you have to stop that, and you have to look within. Oh my God. And sometimes you wish, why did I empower these people to give me so much feedback? Because I'm not enjoying looking at this thing in myself now. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael, so much for your wisdom. I've learned so much, and I hope it's opened up pathways for inquiry for people. And I'm very grateful, not just for you on the podcast, but for you in the world. I'm happy, grateful that organizations get to learn from your wisdom. And I'm hoping to see more of
Alice,
it grow.
Exactly back at you. And actually, I'm going to say this on your podcast, is that we have in our plans to start a podcast. We don't have a podcast, but I want you to please be one of my first guests, because what struck me in this conversation is that you were interviewing me in a sense, but as it's gone on, I'm more and more curious about, now what would I'm really curious about Alice's, and then I'm like, no, I'll try and stay with the sort of the script of it. But I definitely would like to interview you too.
I would love to continue the conversation, Michael. And I'm sure we'll have many others offline as well as we go forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alice,
for being here with me.
Thank you. And thanks for those of you who've stayed with us the whole process.
I hope you've been as inspired by this conversation with Michael Bunting as I have. There is so much wisdom that he's shared with us. It's even hard to zoom in on the key things, and maybe different people will take away different ideas from this. But a couple of things that have stuck with me are this incredibly subtle but important difference between concentration mindfulness, using mindfulness as a tool to ignore the hard stuff, the difficult stuff, breaking your concentration, versus insight mindfulness, using mindfulness as a tool to invite in, with curiosity, all the tough feelings that we normally run away from, and the benefits of doing that. I also deeply resonated with Michael's aspiration to see organizations becoming places of healing versus places of suffering. And also, hopefully, you'll take and experiment some of the practices that he has suggested, such as the 10 minutes of mindfulness every day, or finding an ethical teacher, or looking at your values and the way they can become guidelines to keep you honest and keep you embodying the integrity that you want to bring to the world. You'll find much more about Michael's work in the episode notes. And until next time, stay conscious and stay wise.